because I'm so short. Good morning. Welcome to our Adult Forum series. I'm going to open us with a prayer today, and then I'm going to turn our introduction over to Father Josh. I am sharing a collect from Thomas Merton's book, A Book of Hours. The Lord be with you. My mind is scattered among things, not because of my work, but because I am not detached and I do not attend first of all to God. On the other hand, I do not attend to Him because I am so absorbed in all these objects and events. I have to wait on His grace. But how stubborn and slow my nature is, and how I keep confusing myself and complicating things for myself by useless twisting and turning. What I need most of all is the grace to really accept God as God gives God's self to me in every situation. Father Josh, I'll let you come and make our introduction.
I'm actually sort of nervous. We'll lead all these congregations with countless numbers of people, and then I get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 people here and the internet, and I freeze up. So I am standing here as rector of this church, and Dr. Deborah Kehoe is about to speak to my parish. We are indeed living in an alternate timeline. How did this come to be? Picture it. Anderson Hall, 2002. An 18-year-old Father Josh, about 100 pounds lighter, has signed up for Dr. Deborah Kehoe's Composition 1 class. Only I thought I had signed up for Kathy Green's class, so I got mixed up. Talk about fate. Down the hall comes this woman I didn't recognize, but it was instant adoration. Deborah Kehoe carries calm and centeredness around her like some kind of holy fog. To be in Deborah's presence is to drink from the deep spiritual well that she obviously drinks from. She is my friend. She is my mentor. She is my colleague. As the deacon says in the Eastern Orthodox liturgy, wisdom, let us be attentive.
Well, thank you for that. Now I'm shaking. That was something. Thank you. Thank you, Father Josh. And thank all of you for inviting me into this sacred space to talk about a man who loved sacred spaces, Thomas Merton, one of the most intriguing figures of the 20th century, one whose voice remains forcefully relevant in the 21st. While I've been a Merton enthusiast and to an extent a Merton scholar for 20 years now, I am by no means a Merton expert. I want to get that understood from the outset. I have much left to learn about him, but that's true of just about everyone who goes to study Merton, learn from him. The peace activist John Deere, I don't know if you know him, but he said in a talk not too long ago, he said, we are all trying to catch up with Thomas Merton, and it will be a long time before, if that ever happens. But I'm sure there will be questions that I can't answer. That's my reason for making that disclaimer from the outset. But that doesn't stop me. I'm eager to talk about him, so let me get to it. I'll start with a couple of anecdotes. In 2004, a subcommittee of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, the USCCB, decided that the 2006 publication of the United States Catholic Catechism for Adults would not include an entry on Thomas Merton. Because, according to the bishops, the intended readers of that book, quote, had no idea who Merton was, end quote. Only later did they indirectly reveal the committee's true reason for leaving Merton out of the final text, namely their, quote, uncertainty about Merton's searching toward the end of his life, end quote. So let me decode that for you. The USCCB, along with a sizable number of conservative Catholics, feared that Merton, in his later years, had strayed from the faith and had embraced Buddhism. Not exactly. It's true that Merton was deeply interested in Buddhism. He wrote a number of books and articles on the subject. On his 1968 journey to Asia, he met with the Dalai Lama, who later commented on that meeting, and I quote, "This was the first time I had been struck by such a feeling of spirituality in anyone who professed Christianity," end quote. In the weeks leading up to his untimely death, Merton visited the giant statues of the Buddhas at Polonnaruwa, where he had a mystical experience that he memorably described in his journal as, quote, having been almost forcibly jerked clean out of the habitual half-tide vision of things, end quote. But he never abandoned his Christian, Roman Catholic, monastic, priestly identity, nor did he promote some form of theological syncretism. Simply put, Merton believed that studying Buddhism made him a better Catholic, and that position troubles many traditional guardians of the Church. And so, in 2004, he was deleted from the final draft of the United States Catholic Catechism for Adults. In Washington, D.C., September 2015, Pope Francis addressed a joint session of the United States Congress. Many may not remember the details of what the Pope said, but most Merton fanatics do. Pope Francis highlighted 4 exemplary American figures who improved the lives of other Americans: Abraham Lincoln, Dorothy Day, Martin Luther King Jr., and Thomas Merton, whom he praised as, quote, a man of prayer, a thinker who challenged the certitudes of his time and opened new horizons for souls, end quote. So who needs the United States bishops to tell you who Merton was when you can learn it from the Bishop of Rome himself? Here's my point. Thomas Merton gets mixed reviews. He's not everyone's favorite Catholic, neither is Pope Francis, but that's for another day. His convert's journey from zealous quietist to contemplative activist discomforts and inspires people with equal intensity. The stages of his journey that most compel some people are the very ones that repel others. While Merton's timeless worth ultimately transcends any political label, his corpus of approximately 70 books, plus hundreds of articles and over 1,000 pages of poetry, gets most of its love from the left. Not just the religious left, including members of multiple faith traditions, but the secular left as well, including what he referred to as his friends, his Latin American hippie poet friends, agnostic thinkers, folk musicians, and so on. Yet he is recognized, albeit sparingly, by the religious right, too. Just go to the EWTN website and click on the link to Catholic books. Something along the lines of what you were talking about in your homily, Father. And just go search EWTN for a little while. Search Thomas Merton and see for yourself. There are maybe 2 books that show up there. So he does get some attention from both ends of the spectrum. Merton's vocal protest against commercialism, political corruption, over-reliance on technology, economic injustice, environmental degradation, war, and racism that marks much of his writing of the last decade of his life and got him into trouble with the censors of his order, and caught the attention of the United States government intelligence agencies, resonates prophetically when read in the context of today's intersectional crises. And I hope that the balance of this presentation will provide some insight into why and how that is the case. In one of Merton's most popular books, New Seeds of Contemplation, we find this passage, quote, "Every moment and every event of everyone's life on earth plants something in our souls. Each moment brings with it germs of spiritual vitality that come to rest imperceptibly in the minds and wills of human beings." In order to talk about Merton as a fitting voice for today's challenges, I think it's critical to look at some of the seminal influences that shaped the extraordinary person he finally became, his weaknesses and imperfections not to be overlooked. So I'm going to hopscotch over a timeline of his 53 years of life. 1915, Merton was born in the south of France to free-thinking expatriate artist parents. His mother, Ruth, an American Quaker, and his father, Owen, a New Zealander Anglican. 1921, Merton was 6 years old and his mother died. She informed him by letter that he would never see her again. 1925, Merton was living in France with his father. He was being educated in French schools. 1931, Owen died of a brain tumor, leaving Merton an orphan at 16. 1933, at 18, he traveled solo across Europe. He spent time in Italy, where he was drawn to the churches and was impressed by the unabashed religious devotion of the people. For the first time in his life, he tried to pray. 1934, after a disastrous year as a student at Cambridge University, where he allegedly fathered a child, his legal guardian insisted that Merton return to the United States, where his grandparents lived, in New York. So 1935 to 1939, Merton returned to New York City, where he earned 2 degrees in English from Columbia. He later wrote of that time that what he liked best about Columbia, quote, was the sense that the university was glad to turn him loose in its library, its classrooms, among its distinguished faculty, and let him make what he liked out of it all. He went on to say that he, quote, ended up getting turned on like a pinball machine to great literature and philosophy. He also says that what he loved about Columbia was that it helped him to learn, quote, the value of unsuccess, end quote. Merton was once asked to write, this for some organization that didn't know him very well, and asked him to write an article about his secret to success. And he started off writing something like this. I can't quote it exactly, but he said, of all things in life that you do not want to become, you do not want to become a success. And went on to give his philosophy of why he finds that term and that concept not very useful. So the value of unsuccess, not to be confused with failure. Unsuccess does not aspire to anything final, but values a process of genuine pursuit of truth. During this time, a copy of The Spirit of Medieval Philosophy by Etienne Gilson fell into Merton's hands and became a catalyst for his religious conversion. The story is that he almost threw it out the window when he opened it and found the imprimatur, the Catholic Church had placed on it. He was so offended by that whole idea that he almost didn't read the book, but he did read the book, and it gave him a liberating idea of God that he had never before encountered. God not as a being, but God as being itself. So in 1938, he was baptized as a Catholic. In 1940, he began a career as an English professor at St. Bonaventure College. At this time, he had made application to join the Franciscans. When he told the whole story of his past, they told him to take his application back. So he tried to live as a third order Franciscan for a while, so he was teaching at this Franciscan university, where he continued vigorously to write fiction and poetry. 1941, he was doing charity work in Harlem, where the misery of the poor and the marginalized African American residents there left a lasting impression on his conscience. On December 10th of that year, 1941, he entered Our Lady of Gethsemane, a monastery of the Order of Cistercians of the Strict Observance, the Trappists, in rural Kentucky. For the next 27 years, he lived in the Kentucky countryside, first as a member of the community, finally as a hermit. In later writing, Merton described his eremitic life as, quote, "What I do is live, how I pray is breathe." 1948, while his intentions 7 years earlier were to, quote, "disappear into the Father," Merton was surprised when he was instructed by his superiors to continue his writing. At age 33, he published his autobiography, The Seven-Story Mountain. It's such an audacious thing to do at age 33, and he knew it. It made the bestseller list, much to his surprise and many others, and he discovered himself famous. Over the next 20 years, he became one of the most visible, cloistered religious writers in the world. And in 1966, he became a hermit with a record player and Bob Dylan records in the Hermitage, and jazz that he never stopped loving. He'd play late at night. 1968, he was given permission to travel. In October, he left on a trip with an itinerary that included an extended stay in Asia. On December 10th, 27 years to the day after he entered the monastery, he died suddenly in his room at a guest house in Bangkok. Although persistently controversial, and please believe me, it is a controversy that certain people persist in pursuing, the official cause of death remains accidental electrocution from stepping out of a bath and grasping a badly wired electric fan. Art, nonconformity, distant parents, traumatic loss at an early age, abundant, unfiltered exposure to the varieties of the world, elite formal education, extreme loneliness, an encouraged enthusiasm for the written word, a push-pull relationship with religion. These were just some of the seeds that, when nurtured in the soil of his commitment to a life of prayer, matured into the eccentric, receptive, empathic mind that we meet in Thomas Merton's writing. Yet full fruition took years to unfold, and so a zeroing in on more biographical details is in order. The years 1941 to 1958 in Merton's monastic life were characterized by intense piety and contempt for the world, when he was still high on conversion and triumphantly Roman Catholic. These years also included an increased longing for more separation from the world that he thought he could have only if he were permitted to transfer to another monastic order. His entreaties were rejected. Quote, "It is God's will," he was told, "that you should be riveted to Gethsemane like Christ to his cross." End quote. And herein lies one of the captivating aspects of the Thomas Merton story. This brilliant, sophisticated, independent maverick remained an obedient monk. As if instinctively he understood his need for an imposed structure to stabilize that feral soul of his, even as he kicked against his restraints and made some colossally wrong moves. Still, he understood the value of balance. And in what turned out to be his final decade on earth, he progressed toward connecting the interior and exterior dimensions of his life and modeled that path for others. 1958 was pivotal. It was the year of his celebrated epiphany at the corner of 4th and Walnut Streets in downtown Louisville. It's now 4th and Muhammad Ali. He may have been there. He may go there. There's a big plaque. It's called Merton's Corner now, where he had gone for a doctor's visit. He tells that he, quote, "was suddenly overwhelmed with the realization that he loved all those people." He said, quote, "It was like waking from a dream of separateness, of spurious self-isolation in a special world. the world of renunciation and supposed holiness. And so the following 5 years, 1958 to 1963, are known in Mertonology as his period of turning toward the world, a time of repositioning himself in relation to the world he once tried to escape, a time that would be followed by a veritable explosion of new forms of creativity. Make no mistake, Merton's earlier writing contains much finely crafted work with evidence of his concern for his fellow human beings. But it is in the later period that the content becomes socio-political and the voice becomes impassioned. One after another, he produced powerful writings on peace, social justice, humanism, and the mystical unity of experience, of existence, grounded in divine love. That is the impetus for removing false barriers that we construct between ourselves and others, and that allow us to commit atrocities. Perhaps nowhere else does Merton put this message more succinctly than when he was speaking to an interreligious audience in Calcutta during his Asian sojourn. My dear brothers and sisters, and the inclusive language is added because Merton, his language is not inclusive. We are already one, but we imagine that we are not. And what we have to recover is our original unity. What we have to be is what we already are. So, now I want to mention some titles, a handful of works that display Merton's evolved, integrative worldview, works that convey through diverse forms his belief in this essential and holy unity, as well as his eventual understanding of the responsibilities placed on humans, even contemplatives, to use whatever gifts we have to reveal, promote, and defend that sacred integrity. More than once, Merton was urged to leave his hermitage and join activists in the streets in resistance against war and other forms of oppression. But he contributed his part through prayer and writing, and few people could deny that those were his gifts. The Jesuit priest Dan Berrigan, who went to prison for his anti-war protests, was among those who considered Merton a spiritual advisor in the movement. Furthermore, Merton made it clear that ordinary folk of the world are also obliged to join what he called the cosmic dance and pray fervently and as fully as possible take action to heal division. So here then is a curated list of titles for anyone wishing to read further. Some of my favorites. I won't have everything on this list, but I certainly wanted to. But here we go. New Seeds of Contemplation, 1962. It presents Merton's theology of the true self, the self that is not masked by pretense and delusions, but is the person one was created to be, the self from whom prayer emanates. It shows Merton's insistence, the book, New Seeds of Contemplation, shows Merton's insistence that one could not call himself or herself a contemplative and remain indifferent to the troubles of the world. Merton reportedly made a lot of the other monks mad in his monastery because he often told them that they were not true contemplatives, they were just introverts. They resented that. Can't imagine why. But the distinction was vital in Merton's beliefs. The contemplative seeks union with God through prayer, and one cannot make that contact without then experiencing contact or connection with others. So that's New Seeds. Conjectures of a Guilty Bystander, 1966. This is one of my most favorites. It's a book of Merton's thoughts. They're not fully formed arguments, they're just scraps of thoughts, pieces from his journals that he collected here. Dialogue with the reader about critical matters such as a need for interfaith communication. The phrase guilty bystander captures Merton's view of himself before he realized the imperative for active involvement in alleviating the suffering of humanity. The implication is that there are no innocent bystanders. And then there's the poetry, collections of poetry. And I have dedicated my modest life of scholarship around Merton's works to his poetry. So it's very hard for me to just put this in one or two paragraphs, but here I'll try. Beginning around 1963, Merton produced poetry that was notably focused on socio-political issues. The tone is passionate, it is ironic, the style became increasingly experimental, wildly so in some instances, just impenetrably so, sort of like late James Joyce, who Merton admired very much, and yet it's still very compelling, very magnetic writing. While many of his prose writings of this time demonstrate the acuity of Merton's insights into the human dimensions of the civil rights era, his poetry in response to specific horrors of the time most poignantly reveals the depth of his genuine capacity to feel the pain of others. And one example is the poem Picture of a Black Child with a White Doll, addressed to 11-year-old Carol Denise McNair, one of the 4 girls killed in the Birmingham church bombing of 1963. The poem travels to the heart of the heinous matter by focusing on a photograph of her that was published in Look magazine in March of 1964, in which her arms affectionately enfold a chatty Kathy doll. And I had one just like it. I had that doll. Radiating the evanescent sweetness of childhood, she smiles for her father's camera, unaware of the symbolic magnitude of this image that would crystallize for Merton the madness of her death and hurt him into poetry. The same photograph played a key role in the trial that, almost 40 years after the girls' deaths, convicted the last of the accused bombers of first-degree murder. This was in 2001. The last of them was convicted. Using that picture to keep the jury mindful of the defendant's victims, the prosecuting attorney declared Carol Denise McNair didn't understand that she was supposed to hate that doll. A statement that was profound enough to serve as a summary of Merton's poem written decades earlier. Indeed, that is the message of the poem. Denise McNair did not understand. On the contrary, lacking a false self, she acted on the unimpeded instinct to embrace something alien to her, blessedly unconstrained by the perception of division which inflamed her killer's hatred, as well as the hell they had put themselves in. And that's Merton's poem in a nutshell. And then there's Passion for Peace, Social Essays. It's also a collection of pieces from the 60s. Arranged chronologically, it provides what its editor calls an autobiography of Merton the social critic. It also sheds light on Merton's difficulties with the censors of his order, who wanted to silence him, especially on the subject of the Vietnam War. Merton creatively got around this. He had a young monk mimeograph these essays. I mean, that mimeograph machine was just smoking with these essays, and he would send them out to friends who would publish them in various venues. They came to be known as the Cold War letters, and they're now collected, and you can have them. His unmistakable increasing commitment to denouncing the sins of war and racism is quite prominent in this collection. One of the most timely pieces found in Passion for Peace is his Letters to a White Liberal, written in 1963. It deliberately echoes Martin Luther King's recent letter from the Birmingham jail. And in it, Merton charges privileged, well-intentioned white people for lacking the courage and commitment required to rid American society of racial injustice. And here's just one quote that I pulled from it. If they are forced to listen to what the Negro is trying to say, the whites may have to admit that their prosperity is rooted to some extent in injustice and in sin. And in consequence, this might lead to a complete re-examination of the political motives behind all our current policies, domestic and foreign, with the possible admission that we are wrong. End quote. He exposes white hypocrisy that is quick to get angry and to sympathize, but ultimately unwilling to sacrifice comfort and status in order to bring about true equality. He also identifies racism in American Christian communities. He essentially blames white liberalism for the failure of the black nonviolent resistance efforts and predicts a future in which oppressed blacks may resort to violence as their principal remedy. Merton was roundly criticized. Surprise! Merton was roundly criticized publicly for this article. He was denounced by the sociologist and religious writer Martin Marty. who later retracted his condemnation, publicly retracted his condemnation of Merton's essay when the race riots of the late 60s more or less supported Merton's predictions. It's a very powerful piece of writing. If you haven't seen it, you might find it very edifying. Next item on the list, Raids on the Unspeakable, 1966. Now this is my favorite. It's an offbeat, slender, it's a little tiny book, slender tome of apparently disconnected pieces loosely related by the theme of praise for a liberated consciousness in art, politics, religion, and so on. It's very playful. Merton has a most delightful sense of humor. It makes me laugh sometimes so hard I can't continue reading. It connects with my own sense of humor. In a quaint, playful preface, he addresses the book. He tells him, you're my favorite child. The book is called Raids on the Unspeakable, but he calls it Raids for short, like he's patting him on the back. He says, go out there in the world and make some friends and carry this message. And then suddenly the humor stops and he gets deadly serious. And here's the message that this little book is supposed to convey to the world. Be human in this most inhuman of ages. Guard the image of humanity, because it is the image of God. And then there's Faith and Violence, 1968. This is a treasure chest of Merton's mature opinions on the role of the believer, particularly the Christian, in meaningful interaction with the problems of the world. Among other compelling items, it contains Merton's reaching out to those who might have been harmed or put off by the violent attitudes of professed Christians, in this essay called Apologies to a Non-Believer. It too is quite a punch. Okay, so there's so much more, but now I'm going to turn to my conclusion. And I'm going to conclude with an anecdote, another anecdote. 1 year ago this weekend, I attended the conference of the International Thomas Merton Society in San Jose, California, where I heard an amazing address by the political activist, poet, and editor of Sojourners magazine, Rosemary Berger. Berger's subject was direct transmission of faith, which she distinguished from institutional transmission of faith by saying, and I'm paraphrasing here, I have direct quotes, that the former is a vital and immediate means of sharing revelation for the sake of strengthening the unity of the mystical body, while the latter is more a handing down of accepted knowledge for the sake of preserving the institution. She points to Thomas Merton as the embodiment of direct transmission of faith, and attributes the longevity of his relevance to this feature that can be described with any adjective that denotes a Christ-like abandonment to the mysterious workings of God's love that calls a person to the things of this world. Maybe the adjectives fearless, sacrificial, creative, humble would apply. Berger prefers the adjective weird and provides a brief etymology lesson. The word is derived from the Old English noun for the secondary, bendable, weaker limb of a sapling. It's the origin of the word weird. In other words, not the main limb of the growing tree, not the more stable one, not the one likely to be voted most likely to succeed, not the one that is solidifying with the passing of time, but the subordinate one, the one that doesn't quite make the grade, the one with less to prove and therefore less to protect, but the one that just might surprise you with its tender resilience, the one that might withstand and adjust the challenges of changing weather. Berger concluded her talk by donning a t-shirt printed with the commandment, "Keep Merton weird." And I'll end mine by taking Berger's trope a step further. I'll venture to say that Merton might be passing on a similar message to today's direct transmitters of the faith. It would say something like this: resist deadly finalities. Avoid the stasis that may come with authority. Be the weird ones. Let your breathing be your prayer, and your living always bear witness to the unifying love of God. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.
All right, so we'll start with the questions. Sometimes it takes,
Wait, it's water.
yeah, sometimes it takes several minutes for the questions to
Okay,
come out.
sure.
But like, you're still talking right now.
Oh,
on Facebook.
okay. This is weird.
Yeah.
It is kind of strange.
So there seems to be like a balance, I don't know if I'll call it a balance, between this advocacy, sometimes even political advocacy, I guess, even in writing, and contemplative spirituality.
Mhm.
How would you kind of characterize how that happens in Thomas Merton, this kind of merging of these seemingly different worlds, right?
Yeah. Well, it started with an extreme. It went from one extreme to the other first. He was living a very dissolute, hedonistic life, and then suddenly, this is fascinating to people. Suddenly, this man, he had these degrees, he was writing, he had friends, he was living, this life, and suddenly he went to the most severe order of monks that he could find, and went just completely the opposite direction, where he became very, contemptuous of the world. And if you've ever read The Seven-Story Mountain, you hear that tone, and he was very pious. He later wanted to disown that book. He said, "Please stop bringing that book up. I'm not that person anymore." He said, "That Thomas Merton is dead, but people keep, resurrecting him." So it was like one extreme to the other, and then eventually, an integrating of his contemplative life, which was first. And he says that, and I tried to convey that, probably not very well, but none of your activism, as far as Merton is concerned, is going to be of any use unless it has a contemplative root to it, unless it's connected to prayer and contact with the unity. But it took a long time. He was early 60s before he really got revved up in that direction. He resisted that for a long time. But I think basically it was his prayer life that brought him to that. I don't want to be audacious enough to say this is what Thomas Merton would say, but I've read enough Thomas Merton to have an idea that would be his answer.
Seems to me like this erasing of the fake self.
Oh, absolutely.
And getting to your more sincerely grounded self. It kind of hits to the core of any kind of advocacy.
Right. Yeah, his theology of the false self was spiritual dynamite. It just blasted. And Merton will say, I am talking about myself here. I have quite a false self. And he finally, at some point, said, this is the self that God doesn't even recognize. He said, and that's too much privacy for me. I don't want to live in that self anymore. So, being on guard against the illusions, that obscure your real place in the world, was one of Merton's just most persistent efforts. If you listen, and I recommend them, they're wonderful to listen to. His lectures, that he gave to his. And don't be fooled by the titles, because they often have nothing to do with what's actual. Because he will just go down these avenues, but he always brings them back to that. Don't let your false self run away with you.
Deborah, and you may have said this in the beginning, that if I'm writing something I'm not hearing,
I understand.
so if I missed it, I apologize.
No
But what is it that drew you first to Thomas Merton, and what is it that keeps you going back to
I did not say that, and thank you for asking. I tried to keep myself out. When my first draft of this was like 2 pages about me, to begin with, and I thought, get back on. But it's really, I think, it's a story that I love to relive. I went to the first ITMS meeting In June of 2001, I went with Sister Mary Schoberg, who was one of the pastoral staff at my church, St. John the Evangelist Catholic Church in Oxford. And I had read Merton. I had a friend in graduate school who was from Kentucky, and he was always talking about Merton. I'd read enough to think, okay, well, I'll go. This conference, it is by design. It's an academic conference. I mean, it has a very scholarly aspect. There are some very estimable scholars there, but it's also it's the whole person is being engaged. A lot of workshops, a lot of spiritual workshops, yoga classes, music, lots of music, and I was so talk about turned on like a pinball machine. I've got to come back to this. I as a person who studied English, an English academic, I've been to a lot of MLA conferences, I've been to a lot of college English, nothing like that, except that it has that academic rigor there too as well. So in 2003, before that, I submitted a proposal to read a paper because I knew I couldn't go back to that conference. The next one was in Vancouver. I can't go unless I'm presenting a paper because I wanted Northeast to help me pay for my trip. So I presented a paper there, and it's just a welcoming group of people, and I fell in with these people, and I interested primarily in literary Merton because I don't have any theology background. A lot of people there are understandably theology scholars and some philosophy, but Merton was literary, and that was his education, and his poetry was very important to him. It's not given much critical praise, but he had a writing life all of his life. So I dug into that, and that's sustained me. It's never ending in its resources. And I got convinced to put my name up to be on the board of directors of the ITMS. And I did, innocently, foolishly I did, and after a couple of times, I finally got elected 3 times to this, and I do not belong I don't belong in that setting. I'm not a very good board of directors member, but I do love sitting in that meeting. We had a 6-hour Zoom meeting just the other day, as a matter of fact. And I just love being in the presence of these wonderful people, and I contributed very little. I'm sure it was obvious. I'm ashamed of that, but I still like being around these people. They're brilliant, they're good, they're passionate.
So it sounds like they're enjoying being around you. I like you.
Well, thankfully, I term limits. I can't fall into that again. So. But I'm also editing the Merton Annual, which is the scholarly journal of the organization. So I've gotten myself involved in some things, and I do love it. But what drew me to Merton, is primarily his contemplative poetry. That's
Dr. Kehoe, in the roots of my religious autobiography, I was taught, that we are to strive to throw away humanity in order to achieve godliness, and that's the only way to achieve this kind of piety is to push away from the world as we know it. And there's this interesting dichotomy between like humanity and that being the image of God, and then almost this puritanic view of God is the opposite of humanity, even though we obviously all know Genesis says man was made in his image. And so there's this weird dichotomy. It seemed like Merton, being in a Catholic order, being in a monastic setting, you always have to say, well, the church is the right way. This is the path, but also this connection to humanity and how leading that humanity and being an advocate means being closer to humanity, being close into that humanity. And so how did, this is a struggle I have, is how did Merton deal with kind of that dichotomy there? There's this large religious institution that is kind of forming how my life exists, and also feeling connected to the humanity of those not living in that kind of monastic lifestyle, or just in general.
Well, as we were saying earlier, it was a long path for him, but he did he did eventually find a way to integrate. You know, it was the mystery of the incarnation that just dawned on him in the middle of the street there in Louisville after he had been living this, contentious movie life. He said, I love these people. And it's a famous passage. I mean, most Merton enthusiasts can probably recite it for you, but it ends with, he said, there's no way to explain this. I am a member of a race of people in which God himself, took form. And he said, you can't separate yourself from your fellow humanity. That doesn't mean that he didn't call people stupid idiots, and he had a lot of rage for the things that deserved it, but he never threw away humanity after March of 1958. It was like one of those moments. Merton has a series of epiphanies. His life story is a story of various revelations that.
So as his life arc continued, did he lead more in those latter years toward that human?
Well, it's very ironic. I mean, he became a hermit. He craved that solitude because he needed it. I mean, he just needed that because he had such an active mind and he read prodigiously. It's amazing what Merton was able to do. The same amount of time that we're given. He participated in his order. He did his hours, but he also wrote and wrote. He wrote wherever he could. He read constantly. But as he became a hermit, he gradually became more and more mystically connected to humanity and more driven to talk about timely topics. The war in Vietnam. He had so much to say about that. And he was being told by his superiors, you cannot do this anymore. He was determined. He said, I can't not do it. I got to get these things out there. So it's really a fascinating story how that happened. But the deeper he got into solitude, and the more deeply he integrated his prayer life. Again, that's such a core issue with Merton. Your prayer life. And he said, you're not furnishing God with some words. You're praying, as he said, how I pray is breathe. Make my natural life of ongoing prayer. So that worked on him, to the extent that his love for humanity was intensified by his continual pursuit of what he called the hidden wholeness. So there's a point, a virgin point inside each of one of us where we can become in contact with God, and then that brings us back out to the world. It's a fascinating story. I don't tell it well, but you should check into it yourself. Read some Merton. I think you would be very receptive to Merton's works.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So God as a being versus God as being kind of sounds a lot like what we've been talking about.
Yeah.
Theology last year.
Really?
The past year.
Have you read, I know you've read you're the theologian here. Etienne Gilson, have you read that?
I haven't really read it extensively.
I mean, it's old. It's an old book, but it's evidently a standard. And Merton, he loved medievalism, and he bought this book because he saw medieval, and he opened it. He was on the train going, and he opened it, and he saw the imprimatur, and he thought, "No, I'm not reading. This is a Catholic book." And and yet,
yeah, that name shows up in various forms, and what it's called theological liberalism,
right?
Where we're kind of not depersonalizing God, but trying to distinguish between this idea of God as an image in our head that looks probably something like us,
right?
Versus just the groundedness of being in and of itself, like not what is the word I'm looking for? Not what we do to animals sometimes.
Anthropomorphize.
We're not anthropomorphizing God, and that actually makes God a richer concept. And it makes prayer something that's not just, as you said, talking to something that we're imagining in our heads, but actually participating, and making prayer, grounding prayer as a form of participation in the world itself that we encounter.
That's Merton.
Jim, that's one thing we've been trying to do when we compose the prayers of the people that we use during our services, or to lift up these different names and different images for God, so that it's not always, dear Heavenly Father, that we're trying to lift up different images of God.
And images are so helpful in shaping consciousness.
You did such a good job.
Oh,
This was awesome.
Thank you.
Can we talk about unsuccess for 1 minute?
Oh, I'd love to. I want you to read. I think would really love this article because they did not know what they had done when they tapped on this Merton. Like, let's ask this successful person the secret of his success. And I mean, this opening line is, well, the last thing on earth you want to be is a success, and goes into why that is. But yeah, go ahead. What do you think about?
I just think of like these really slimy businessmen type people and their idea of success. And yet they project the falsest version possible of themselves to the world, and then they just become that. Almost like ontologically they become that. And so where's the original person?
Right. And that's exactly what Merton had in mind. In the mid-60s, he produced a book of poems called Cables to the Ace, and it's just, it is savagely ironic, but he aims at, that particular version of the false self, the businessman, and he writes, there's one of his poems that it ends with, it's all about money, money makes, I want my money to write me business letters every day, and so he had a lot of contempt for that, because it can do so much harm. That was his main concern. Taking that message out into the world and doing harm with it, because you're right.
Hey Tim, when I posted that meme, I believe it was the Dalai Lama, said something about what the world needs now are less successful people. As someone we both know took great exception to that.
Oh yes.
Yeah.
Hey, well, that's a word that has just been, embraced and wrong.
I disagree with Mr. Lama.
Oh yeah, Mr. Long. Forgot about that one. This is kind of a person who is that picture of, success according
He's
to.
got his toe stepped on with that.
Yeah.
Well, there's also in another one of Merton's wildly experiment, and the one that fascinates me, and I'll probably die with a copy of this book in my hands. It's called The Geography of Le Braire, and it's the most expansive thing he ever did. But he has, and it was unfinished. I mean, he never did get to revise it, but he has this one passage where he's talking about Christianity and the business world, the corporate world, and he says Jesus Christ is sitting in a hotel room waiting for someone to bring him a suit. It's like we got to dress him up to meet our expectations.
That's incredible, because I was just thinking about that, this suit being like this symbol for this kind of thing. And you might have noticed our church is more theologically oriented than literary oriented, because all of our questions to you, of course, have been about.
Well, I expect that. I mean, that's to be expected. But those are the questions I fear the most. Those are not the ones that I can draw upon my successes.
All right,
How do we
going on an hour. So.
Goodness.
It goes about that.
It does.
Great.
By the way, if you haven't seen that.